So today we're going to talk about the neuroscience of pain. And I think pain is a very special kind of perception. I think it's a perception that has to do with the violations of boundaries. So you could think of the human being as a set of boundaries. The most classic example being the demarcation between our bodies and the external environment, with our skin comprising the main boundary. When this boundary is violated, if your skin is physically breached, you have what's known as somatic pain. It's very specific, very localizable, and feels well defined. Now, there are other boundaries. For instance, you could think of your internal environment that comprises your various organ systems. If those boundaries are violated, you could have visceral pain that is not as well defined, not as well localizable as somatic pain. And I would argue in a different video that if you think of a different kind of boundary, social boundaries, and if that's violated, in a sense, you could have what I would call social pain, which actually has a lot of overlap with the neuroscience of physical pain. So let's talk about the more classic, if you will, simplistic version of somatic pain that is a little bit easier to understand. And I'm here referring to what happens when we breach or when there's a physical breach to our skin. So you could imagine if someone suffers an injury or like a break in their skin, what then ensues is that a bunch of chemicals are released, prostaglandin, potassium, bradykinin, and these chemicals would then act on nerve fibers, which then project to the spinal cord, which will then ultimately project to your brain. And then you could have a pain perception. There are different kinds of pain fibers. There are three of interest that help with the perception of pain. One of them is the alpha beta fiber that tends to be the widest or the largest in terms of its diameters. It's also very myelinated. So myelin is a very lipid-rich material that actually helps with the propagation of electrical signals down your nerve fibers. So that's the alpha beta fibers, and the alpha beta fibers actually helps with processing touch sensation. So it doesn't really perceive or doesn't really process pain stimuli. You have the alpha delta fibers that's more thinly myelinated, is not as myelinated as the alpha beta fibers. Its diameters are of intermediate size, and they help process acute pain, also known as first pain. And finally, you have C fibers that are not myelinated. They have a very thin diameter, and they are more involved in chronic pain perception. So I want to talk about what I believe is a fundamental pain circuit, and I think this is maybe one of the central principles of pain. So for pain perception, especially pain perception that occurs the level of the spinal cord, you have like four main key players. So you obviously have the neuron or the nerve that carries the pain signal from the periphery of your body. That's called the primary afferent nerve. This nerve will then intersect, if you will, with a projection neuron that relays that signal to your brain for processing. Now, very important in the processing of pain is a different kind of nerve that actually offers modulation, that actually helps dampen the pain experience. That's also, we could call that the descending pathway or the descending pain pathway. We'll talk about that in a few slides. And then there's an interneuron that also helps with the modulation of pain. Now, the modulation of pain utilizes multiple neurotransmitters. The ones of interest are opiates, serotonin, and norepinephrine. It's not depicted on the slide, but I think it's important to note that the descending neuron or the neuron that offers modulation does so through these various neurotransmitters. Once again, the neurotransmitters of interest are serotonin, opiates, and norepinephrine. So we talked about how pain is relayed from the periphery of your body all the way to your brain. Why don't we examine some of the more classic pain pathways? They're called the ascending pain pathways that are involved in the processing of pain. There are two main pain pathways. One of them, a lot of doctors learn about this pathway in medical school. It's called the spinothalamic tract. This specific pathway answers the question, where is the pain? And so, as with most pain processing pathways, it begins in the spinal cord. The dorsal root ganglion of the spinal cord proceeds to the lateral thalamus and then goes to the somatosensory cortex. Then you have that final experience of the location of the pain. This is called the sensory discriminatory pathway. The other pathway is called the affective emotional pathway. I tend to answer the question, how much, what is the quality and intensity of the pain? Like the sensory discriminatory pathway, it begins the dorsal root ganglion, then proceeds to various parts of your brainstem, goes to the medial thalamus, and then actually terminates at different parts of your cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, the amygdala, the various parts of your prefrontal cortex. And then you actually have the subjective experience of pain. And some experts believe that the that feeling of pain, that conscious perception of pain, is as a result of the interaction and combination of these two pathways. And then you also have a descending pathway that provides modulation to the ascending pathway. And if you've noticed, there's this very interesting phenomenon where, for instance, when one is under stress or when one is in a very scary situation and you sustain an injury, you actually are not aware of the injury immediately until afterwards. It is believed that that is due to activation of your descending pathway that offers modulation of pain. There are other there were experiments in the 1960s that actually showed that there are certain parts of your brain, if you stimulate, one of those parts is called the periaqueductal gray area. If you stimulate this part of your brain, the animal, the organism would not experience pain. You could perform surgery on the organism and they will be fine. So this descending pathway is so like a reverse of the affective emotional pathway. It starts off in a diversity of areas in your brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, the amygdala, the insula, and then projects to different parts of your subcortical structures, goes to the periaqueductal gray area, projects to the RVM, your brainstem, and then ultimately terminates in the dorsal root ganglion. Let's just spend a very quick moment talking about how this descending pathway actually modulates pain perception. Let's look at a theory. So you have your neuron that carries pain signal from the periphery and then sends the signals to a projection neuron that would transmit that signal to your brain. So that's a typical pain perception. So there's an interneuron that primarily uses opiate. And this interneuron receives input from your descending pathways. When this interneuron is activated, it releases opiates. And I should also say that the primary afferent neuron that had passed the initial pain signal has opiate receptors. So when the interneuron releases opiate, the opiate goes and binds to the opiate receptors on the primary afferent neuron and actually prevents the release of, say, glutamate or whatever neurotransmitter was going to cause the activation of the postsynaptic neuron. Also, the opiate that is released from your opiate interneuron binds to the opiate receptor in the postsynaptic neuron and hyperpolarizes that postsynaptic neuron and prevents its activation. So that is one theory, one way in which it is believed that the descending pathway offers modulation to pain perception. This is a very, very brief overview, very brief introduction into the neuroscience of pain. That was all for now. Thank you for watching.